little introduction, and then we really start the session. Okay, so Jan, please.
Okay.
Good morning.
Kathy, sorry, Jan is going to read a little text, and then I say some words, and then you start.
Oh,
just
Good morning.
Of the session.
Good
are you
morning.
going to introduce me?
Good morning. Let's
Jan?
start.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll let you start. Hi.
Good morning. Let's start the internationalization session. We thank the guests and everyone who signed up. We inform you that from now on, the activity is being recorded. The recording will be made available on YouTube of the Administration Department. We ask participants to turn off the microphones and cameras. Participate in your solidarity campaign. We are accepting donation of clothing and non-perishable food. Donations can be delivered to SEADM Faces Ground Floor. We will be very grateful if you can help us this campaign. Now we give the floor the coordinator, Siegrid.
Okay, thank you so much, Jan, for your introduction. Just to say that it's a great pleasure to be here at the session organized by the Academic Week of our department. I'm happy that we are developing our internationalization sessions and initiatives. And this gives us the honor to invite two very important people. One is Professor Kathy, who is from the Shanghai International Studies University, and very gently was available and to participate at the session with us. So thank you so much, Kathy, for being here with us. We have a big time difference. It is not easy to connect technology and all the Eastern-Western issues that we have to deal. She was very patient with helping to organize everything. So I thank you so much for being here with us and sharing your knowledge and your studies with our audience. And also later we are going to hear Professor José Luíz Barros Fernandes, who is also, I will introduce a little bit later, but is also very welcome. So good morning, Zhao Shanghai here in Brazil, and good evening, Wan Shanghai in Shanghai. So please, Kathy, you can start your presentation. Thank you for being here.
Okay. Thank you. Should I introduce myself a little bit?
Oh, yes, please.
Oh, okay. I'm very glad, very delighted, and to be and honored to be invited to this conference to talk about my research topic, interculturality and conflict management in the Chinese culture and MNCs. So I graduated with a PhD in communication from University of Arizona in the United States, and came back to China in 2009 and started to work for Southwestern University of Finance and Economics in my hometown, a city in southwest of China. And I stayed there for over 13 years. And recently I transferred my job to Shanghai International Studies University in Shanghai, and it's a new adventure for me. I'm considering it a great opportunity because Shanghai is a much more cosmopolitan city, and where my research can be better done. I will have more resources and more cooperators here. And my team here is great. It's called Intercultural Institute, subsidiary to the university directly. So let me come back to my research topic today. My topic is interculturality and conflict management. So the outline of this research, of this presentation include these parts. So first I will introduce culture and interculturality. What are some recent trends? What are some traditions in studying culture and interculturality? And what role does cultural difference at national level play in the conflict in the MNCs today? And then I will talk about conflict studies, especially Chinese conflict studies, to try to draw a model to summarize the current, the prior research into a model, and to present the model to you. And finally, if I have time, I will introduce another study I did in the about the conflict in MNCs in China. Okay, it's an AMIC study. I will talk, if you don't know what AMIC study is, I will explain it later a little bit. So interculturality, according to UNESCO website, is the existence and equitable interaction of diverse cultures and the possibility of generating shared cultural expressions through dialogue and mutual respect. Another way to say it is interculturality includes dynamic and evolving relationships between groups that include exchange and dialogue. So not like multiculturalism, which emphasizes the coexistence of cultures and the equal opportunity of expression of one's cultural beliefs and practices. Interculturality emphasizes the relationship, the dynamic and evolving relationships between groups. Okay, so it's emphasizing that relationship side, the interaction of the cultures. Okay, so that's what I am interested in. And when we talk about interculturality, we need to talk about the traditions of understanding culture. There are different perspectives of culture. One of the forefathers of intercultural communication studies is Edward T. Hall, who visualized culture as an iceberg. So if you look at this picture of the iceberg, you will see there's the below surface part of the culture and above the surface part of the culture. So the below the surface part include all those invisible things such as attitude, values, concepts of time, definition of the community, identity, for example, and those the part that's more visible would be above the surface, and mostly practices of culture, behavior, symbols, for example. So Hall proposed this metaphor of culture, which makes us look at culture as more of an object that's more static with its own composition. Okay, and following this tradition, the researchers have proposed some, theories such as the value dimensions of culture. Among the most famous ones are Hofstede, Trompenaars, and Turner, and Hall himself. So these scholars would look at different dimensions of the values of culture and try to come up with this framework of dimensions of cultural values to compare and contrast cultures. For example, Hofstede has proposed altogether 6 dimensions of cultural values. I have made a little bit comparison of the 3 countries using the cultural comparison tool on the website of HofstedeInsights.com. And as you can see on the 6 dimensions, value dimensions of culture, Brazil represented in blue, China in purple, the US in green are compared on all 6 dimensions. And here you would have these scores of the, of each culture. For example, in the first dimension, first value dimension, power distance, we have the US, we have the China that has the highest power distance, and the US has the lowest. And in the second value dimension, individualism, the US, as far as I know, has ranked the highest among all the countries on the dimension of individualism, and it's much higher than Brazil and China. And on the dimensions of masculinity, both China and the US are higher than Brazilian culture. In terms of uncertainty avoidance, Brazil actually ranks much higher than the US and China. And long-term orientation, as far as I know, China has the longest term orientation among all the countries in the world. That's why it tops, above both Brazil and the US. And on the value of indulgence, both US and Brazil are much higher than China. So these value dimensions of cultural theories are trying to look at culture as something static, that has certain characteristics, and that may not change. Actually, Hofstede himself said cultural values don't change. Their practices, their forms may change, but their values never change, which are debated. Actually, what he said is debated in the field of cultural studies and many fields of studies. But basically, this school of traditions of cultural studies think that culture is basically changing. It's static, it's fixed. So concerning this school of thoughts, this tradition of intercultural study, we think that the cultural essentialism is something that we should avoid. Cultural essentialism is the idea that national cultures exist with fixed or predictable cultural characteristics. Okay, just like what value dimensions of culture have depicted about culture. But we find this, many scholars have find this problematic, and they have proposed alternatives to cultural essentialism, such as small culture proposed by Holiday in 1999, trying to use, the organizational culture or some community culture or culture even created by several people from different cultures to look at the contextualized culture. Okay, so to avoid using the national level culture or the big picture, fixed culture in their study. The cultural hybridity is proposed by Baba in 1911. And she emphasized the cultural identity, that cultural identity is fluid, not fixed. Okay, and people can pick their own identity in different circumstances and under and contexts. Okay, they can choose. Their identity can be fluid and depend contingent on certain contexts and circumstances. Well, liquid interculturality proposed by Derving in 2016 is something that we want to emphasize here in this lecture. Essentialist approaches to culture can be viewed as solid, placing cultures in fixed boundaries, while liquid approaches to interculturality challenge cultural essentialism with the idea of diversities. So liquid approach is to look at the people from different cultures when they interact. They try to adapt to each other, to accommodate each other's styles, to actually adjust their expectations of communication styles of each other, and form this dynamic communication, intercultural communication situations. So that's what liquid interculturality is mostly about, is to not look at culture as something, cross-cultural or comparison. Those people who do cultural comparison would look at culture. They would look at culture as something fluid or liquid. So that brings me to want to talk about the yin-yang perspective of interculturality, I find that the yin-yang model of Chinese culture, to be more particular, the Taoist culture, very helpful in helping us understand this liquid interculturality approach. So liquid approach to interculturality. When you look at the yin-yang fish, they are, they have their form, but their form is very flexible. It goes with the flow, and you can tell these two, these two yin-yang fish, they're interacting with each other, they're complementing each other, and to form a circle which represent perfection in the Chinese culture. And a more abstracted form would be the yin-yang symbol, where the yin-yang fish become, the symbolic yin-yang part of that symbol. You can see the dots, the black dot and the white dot, and that represents, that symbolizes the reality where you have something, in me, and I have something in you. That there's a little bit of you in me, there's a little bit of me in you. And there's boundary, but the boundary is fluid. It's changing, it's ever evolving. So this dynamic yin-yang form, I think, can describe the interculturality very well. So based on the tradition, this tradition of interculturality study, we did a study on the on culture's impact on conflict and conflict management in multinational corporations in China. We want to study the conflict and culture, okay, in the context of multinational corporations, because conflict is something that's interesting, that is a very good reflection of interculturality. Even though people may have conflict in the from different backgrounds, they may have conflict at workplace, and they have to work together to reach certain agreements in order to fulfill their own goals. So that's why I picked this topic. The background of this research is that China has evolved to become a major recipient of inflows of FDIs. And many MNCs have set up their offices, their factories, their investments in China. So MNCs becomes a place where cultures clash, and the people from different cultural backgrounds will have to work together to form teams. And it's a place where you could observe conflicts. And there's this tradition of conflict research in international business, cross-cultural management, and intercultural communication. So it's not a new branch of study. It's just something, that's ongoing for, for many years. People just add new contribution to this branch of study. The field calls for contextualized amic studies, because Chinese culture has its unique aspects of dealing with, unique way of dealing with conflict. I think, when you design a study, you have to take into consideration the locals' perspectives, to look at the contextualized. When I talk about amic study, it's in contrast to atic study. Amic study is to study the culture inside the culture, to become an insider of the culture. So as an ethnographer, you would live with the culture for a period of time and try to study the culture within the culture and understand it from the local people's perspective. So that's something I would like to do. As for atic studies, those studies are more comparing and contrasting cultures and looking at the cultures as an outsider. So taking on a more objective and more static points of view. So the study intends to explore culture's role in the communication at workplaces and cultural differences association with conflict at workplaces and culture's impact on the conflict management styles at workplaces. I take on a mixed method approach. So we first did interview studies, and then we did a questionnaire survey among 280 employees and managers working in the MNCs in China. So at the beginning of the study, we were, conceptualizing conflict. So qualitative study and observations easily found that cultural differences exist within MNCs, but whether they are always associated with conflict is not certain. In my literature review, I didn't find I didn't find a lot of study who have, accumulated evidences that cultures always lead to conflict. Cultural difference always lead to conflict. Although there are, terms such as intercultural conflict, but empirical evidences are rare, especially in more updated researches. So I think this is more complicated than we would think because it depends on how people define conflict in the first place. Most Chinese, when you ask them, do you have conflict with who and who, such and such, they would say no, we don't have any conflict. That means conflict, well, for Chinese means some extreme verbal and physical attack, not in the sense of some Western definition we will talk about later. And also how people perceive conflict in Chinese context. People would think conflict is very, not just in Chinese conflict but context, but in other contexts as well, people usually think conflict is bad. But what is conflict and what is the conflict about? Is it about work issue? Is it about relationship, communication style, management style? All these could differ, as in how culture relates to conflict, and with whom and in what circumstances they have conflict. Superior, boss, subordinate, or peer. All these could affect the conflict perception and conflict management styles. So I think the answer is not easy. It's not a quick one. So we adopted the Western way, we adopted this conflict definition because it embodies more, wider range of conflict topics. It's an express struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving their goals. So Wilmot and Hawker in 2010 put forward this definition. I think it's a very good definition because it emphasizes that it has to be expressed struggle. And there are two interdependent parties, and they perceive incompatible goals, scarce resource, or interference from others in achieving their goals. It's quite clear, definition, and that's something we use in the study. Overall, the basic assumption or impression is that cultural difference predicts conflict, even though empirical evidence is not that much. Okay, our survey study carried out in 2017 to 2018, exploring cultural distance and conflict frequency and or intensity, as well as conflict management, turned out to find the opposite of the assumption or impression to be true. So, when we tried to associate, we did observe quite a lot of cultural differences brought by the MNC's organizational culture, rooted in their own home culture, and the local employees representing the local culture. There are quite a lot of cultural differences in all aspects: the management style, the communication style, way they, the content of the communication, etc. But we failed to find the, there's significant association between cultural difference and the conflict. In fact, in fact, the cultural difference doesn't even relate to the communication expectation violation. So our explanation, there might be several explanations to this, to this finding. But we will, talk about it later. But mainly we attribute this to interculturality. So when, you have these multinational organizations, and most of them are from Western countries, some of them are from Asian countries. The local employees have already been acculturated, adapted to the organizational culture to a lot, to a great extent, and their expectations, they have the expectations of cultural difference. So it doesn't necessarily lead to many surprises. And Chinese are more they like to conform to their leaders, and a lot of times they don't express their disagreements. Okay, and when these companies try to recruit people, they recruit local employees, they recruit a lot of the managers who have overseas experience. So the local Chinese who have already had overseas experience, some of them have been educated abroad or have worked abroad. So they are, it's easier for them to adapt to the company culture. So all these could contribute to this finding. And that actually adds to the evidence that we shouldn't look at culture as just some static object that has fixed space within themselves or between themselves. The globalized world has brought more opportunities for people to know each other, to interact, and that actually shortens to some extent the distance, and also when people adapt, like the yin-yang fish, they would eventually adapt to make this perfect circle in their interaction and create their own small culture, what holiday would call. Numerous studies have been done on culture's influence on conflict management styles, and most found that people across cultures deal with conflict differently. This concerns the conflict management styles. This has a lot of evidence because many studies have done on the conflict management styles and culture does have an influence on conflict management styles. Edward T. Hall famously stated, communication is culture and culture is communication. So conflict management styles vary across cultures, but this statement doesn't explain when people come together and interact with each other to try to manage conflict, what would happen, okay? So will their conflict management styles also adapt? I think our study, actually one of our findings is that the Chinese local employees would adopt the company expected norms of conflict management, and that helps them actually adapt socio and culturally to the company environment. So that's another surprising finding. The Chinese will adopt a different style of conflict management than their own culture, than their own local culture. So perception of workplace conflict, there's negative view, there's positive view, and neutral view. And we take on a more neutral view. We think, we concur with Chua and Jing in 2020's statement, conflict is double-edged sword. it matters how it is managed matters. So then these are mainly our findings. Cultural differences at national level is not associated with either communication expectancy violation or conflict. Conflict management styles can be changed for local Chinese employees, which leads to better sociocultural adaptation to the organization. And the conclusion is the static view about cultural difference and interculturality should be replaced with or complemented by the liquid approach or yin-yang approach to interculturality. Another study was done with to produce a model of cooperative conflict management with the Chinese, and this is more of a in-depth study of the Chinese way of doing manage conflict. It mainly helps those practitioners, managers, people who need to communicate with the Chinese to solve problems or manage conflict. So I hope that this model will be helpful for these people, will be, somewhat helpful. The Chinese conflict studies have found that Chinese may define conflict differently and perceive conflict differently than the Western Western view of conflict. And also the Chinese conflict studies, it's found that Chinese usually avoid conflict, or they would use obliging style or a compromising style a lot in the conflict management when they deal with their own people in the Chinese context. And there are many other amic concepts such as faith, harmony, collectivism involved in conflict management. We will talk about it later. So this article is published in this book, our article co-written by me and Pamela Cook. So this book is a very good book. I recommend it. It's conflict management and your cultural communication. Not because it published one of my, one article that's written by me, but I think there are many other conflict scholars who have contributed some great ideas in this book. Since it is widely acknowledged that Chinese culture prioritizes harmony and conflict avoidance, positive conflict outcomes are often thought difficult to achieve in the Chinese context, as avoidance is known to have primarily negative outcomes. This is mainly found in Western, by Western scholars of, organizational studies. They, because the avoiding of conflict will produce some prolonged problems for the future and for the relationship, and it's basically not very productive. That's why avoidance is often considered to be primarily negative. Liang, Cook, and Lu indicated no matter the culture, avoidance and repression of conflict is as dysfunctional as domineering and imposition in the long run. How long do I still have, Siegrid? Dr. Siegrid?
We have had 35 minutes now for the whole session, so I think another 5 to 10 minutes to wrap up.
Okay,
and
I'll wrap up then.
We have questions and answers.
I'm sorry, you're too polite to interrupt me.
It's a very special session. I would not be able to interrupt you.
Okay, I'll wrap it up very quickly. So basically, the organizational studies, workplace conflict studies have shown that you shouldn't choose avoidance as a conflict management style, but Chinese culture is famous for avoiding conflict in order to maintain the superficial harmony. Of course, the ideal harmony would be achieved if both the relationship and task goals are achieved. So the Western theories on communication styles, actually, we don't find them very helpful in describing Chinese, in studying Chinese conflict management style. And these people, Friedman, Chi, and Liu in 2006 found that their Chinese respondents often displayed a long-term orientation, reporting tactics such as do nothing right now, but draw a lesson for future actions, and say nothing but collect more data on my own. In other words, they found that avoidance was a tactic for achieving a satisfactory resolution of the conflict in the longer term. So that's their study, and it partly, explains why Chinese like to use avoidance strategy. Whether it suits the modern enterprise is another problem, is another question we actually want to answer here. We also agree with Liang Cook and Lu that avoidance is more dysfunctional. But in our, based on, critically analyzing the Western theories and the models and try to combine the Chinese conflict studies, we built this process model of Chinese conflict management. And we find that in order for people to deal with conflict with the Chinese, it's better for them to understand these Chinese values, that is collectivism, guanxi, faith, power, high context, and it's research based, not just our our own view, but supported by researchers. And also the toolbox that people can use to deal with Chinese in conflict situations are such as cooperative social context. You can create cooperative social context, persuasion rather than coercion, confirming social faith. It's important, showing nonverbal cues expressing warmth, implementing corporate norms and methods of handling conflict. All these are research-based and supported by evidences. And that's, the first two units of the process model. But there are some others. I think, because of the time restraints, I'll stop here. If you're interested, you can read the article in detail. And I don't have time to go through another study we did with the Chinese employees negotiating differing conflict management expectations. And you can find it by yourself if you are interested. And I'll just stop here. And just to say that I hope the research done by scholars, including me, can be helpful for practitioners in the field. That can help them understand Chinese more and help with the interculturality, and people can really form a perfect circle in their communication. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Kathy, so much. No, it hurts my heart to finish your presentation, because such a special moment, so difficult to organize with time frame and all the agenda and the event and technology, that once we are here sharing that beautiful knowledge, we don't want to stop, of course. And well, it's very nice to hear you, and beautiful how you construct the arguments and share the knowledge with us. And talking about cultures and interculturality is very inspiring and interesting, especially because we are willing to connect more to the world, and Brazil needs to do a better job on that. Connecting more and internationalizing more, and this is one of the reasons why we have this session. So thank you immensely
for giving me the opportunity.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And I want to now ask the audience if they have a question. If anyone wants to set a question, you can put it on the chat. If you are unsure with the language, you can put your question in Portuguese, and I can help with the translation. So, but meanwhile, just having the benefit of a first question, I would like, many times you say, I would like to set the first question, and many times you say like, oh, in Western view, Chinese culture is like that, and indeed Chinese culture is or not like that. So my question is, being Chinese, but also having spent so much time out of China studying, developing your research, and once coming back, which are the cultural stereotypes that you had to deal with, and that motivated your research to try to explain this is not exactly like that, or they motivated you to do a research to better explain Chinese culture for the Western world. So if you can mention 2 or 3 main things that you noticed, oh, the Western world has a complete misunderstanding of Chinese culture, of course, in the business and organizational environment.
Am I to answer this question right now? I thought
Yes,
waiting.
please.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I think, well, because I had the, education background in PhD study in the US, I did have opportunity to talk with people there and try to learn their culture, try to adapt to their culture, and then came back. I learned a lot of Western theories and models, and I think that's, those actually are very helpful in helping me form my research paradigm, so-called paradigm, research models, how I should think. But after staying in China, after coming back to China and staying in the academic world for quite a long time, I did find that in my data collection, in reality, those theories and models may have some what's misfit, may be somewhat misfit with the Chinese way of, because the whole philosophy and whole concept is different, whole framework of thoughts are different. So if you look at, you want to try to fit the round peg into the square hole, what the English speakers would say, you will force them into it, it just doesn't fit. So I think when we look at the interculturality in a more fluid way, like the yin-yang approach, it actually makes more sense to me. So I think there's a tendency in the world now to try to be aware of just applying the Western theories and views and models directly to study the a local culture, a culture that's non-Western, or that's something that's very different from the Western culture. So after I came back, I started to try to study Chinese phenomenon more, because after going out of the country, I'm more aware of my own identity as a Chinese. I grew up here, and when I was there, I look at myself better. So after I came back, I use some new perspective to look at my own culture, and that helps me to be sensitive, to be aware. But at the same time, I don't accept, what I learned in the West uncritically. I try to, use it critically. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a question in the chat from João Pedro. What is the big difference between Eastern and Western culture in the multinational companies?
Right. Well, there are many differences. I think in MNCs, there are several aspects of differences. The major ones are open communication and indirect communication. So when the Chinese especially when they talk to their boss, they won't be direct. They will be especially careful about protecting the face. I don't know if students understand the concept of face, to protect the face of their boss.
I think not, Kathy, if you want to shortly explain, because this is something very important of the Chinese culture, and
Right.
most of the Brazilians, they have never had contact with this value. So if you want to just shortly explain.
I invite Professor Fernandes to join because he must have had such, experience in Shanghai. So feel free to interrupt and, add your thoughts.
Sure.
Face is do you want
No,
to
please,
say
you
something?
first. You first. Please.
Okay, I just explained the concept of face. Face has two aspects. One is lian, the other is mian. Lian is more like morality of a person. So the moral line of a person. When we say you don't have lian, that means you have low moral, or you have no morality. You have no morality. Well, the other aspect of face is public image. That's what we in MNCs mostly talk about, is the public image you want to present to people. And it's a social capital actually in China. If you have mian, the other aspect of face, then people will, help you. People will agree with whatever you say. If they're trying to maintain your face, trying to protect your face. And oftentimes Chinese subordinates will protect the face of the public image of the boss. And I'm sure you have such things too in Brazil. It's just maybe called differently. And the degree of the importance may be different.
If I may add on this, this is exactly what I could perceive in a multinational organization, such as a multilateral institution, right? A bank like an NDB. So what you could really perceive, and there was interesting because we could have staff from different countries, including China. So Chinese, Russian, South African, Brazilian, and so on. But one thing when you are leading a group like this is the differences in behavior. And this point that Professor Katie mentioned, it was very clear in terms of, of trying to once they believe in the leader, and they believe in the values of the leader, they really try to protect, they really try to follow in a way to that in the end, my understanding is that they believe that all the group can then, grow together. So this was one characteristic that was very, one could observe very clear there.
Yeah, the leader and the follower relationship can be very different. So you don't challenge your boss that often. I mean, not very often, unless it's really urgent issue. You follow what he or she said, to take less responsibility of failure, and also to give face. Actually, it's a social face thing. So that's a big difference here. And there's the other aspect of actually this can derive many other aspects of difference between, for example, the meeting. So how to hold a meeting. Usually in Chinese context, the leader will, talk through and through, and the followers will just listen and take notes and then implement afterwards. And that's a big difference. But I think brainstorming is a new idea for Chinese, and we're learning.
But Professor Katie, if I can, make one question, because I think it was your presentation was very insightful. And I could also remember many cases that I had to deal with in the company there. But my question would be the following. You mentioned that China received lots of FDI, and we know that received lots of investments, and then many companies, Western companies, went there for joint ventures, and then you explained a lot of this interaction, right, that happened in China. My question would be, if we go in the other direction, let's take the case of Brazil, that also receives lots of, investments, foreign investments, including from China. So when Chinese companies come to Brazil, or let's say, as a big investor and maybe, the main investor of the company here, how is then the conflict managed? Is it in the same way? I mean, or when you have the CEO as a Western and the CEO as an Eastern, it makes a difference in the conflict management inside the company.
Yeah, that's something, we're doing right now to study the Chinese overseas enterprises. It's not, I'm telling you, honestly, it's not doing very well. Because the Chinese overseas enterprises are using the Chinese communication styles. And that's something they need to change. And our studies are to help them to understand what the global culture is like, the international environment is like, and how they can change to accommodate, the global leadership styles and the particular country's leadership styles. I'm not saying that all are like that, but they are, in general, most of them lack the intercultural communication knowledge or skills. And some of them just don't think it's important. And that's something not very good. Yeah. So we're doing, a very important project actually right now, investigating the overseas Chinese companies. Yeah, and actually, Dr. Siegrid is part of it now, and she might do some research in the Chinese companies in Brazil.
Okay, thank you. Well, due to the time, I think now we need to move on a little bit. We can come back to questions to both of you after José Luís' presentation. But yes, it is, I liked your question, Professor José Luís, because it gives a sense to the investigations that we want to conduct. So this is the reason why we need to understand the better interculturality and the conflict management possibilities and communication styles. Because we need to, from our side, we also need to do our part and be able to accommodate, to understand, and to help with that yin-yang process where both fish can swim together and in a harmonic way. So thank you again immensely, Kathy, for your presentation, very inspiring. But we need to move, and we have another very inspiring presentation now. So Professor José Luís has been, and after coming back from China, is going to be again our volunteer professor at our department, teaching in English and bringing all this knowledge that he has developed there. But he's a director of the Central Bank of Brazil, and this is the reason why he went to China institutionally and to develop important projects there. So please, Professor José Luís, the floor is yours to share your thoughts and your contributions, and we come back to more dialogue and question and answers after your presentation. So, and thank you for coming and contributing with us and being with us here at this session. Very special, very important moment. We can't hear you, José Luís. I think maybe just opening.
Yeah. Hello? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Now
Okay. Let me just see if you can see my, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we do see.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just double check it here. Just a minute. Yeah. Now I cannot see my presentation. Let me see if I can see it. Okay.
I think it might happen.
Let me see if I can. Okay,
when you expand your presentation, you may not see us.
Yeah. Let me just double check it here. Yeah. Oh, no, I cannot see the presentation now. Just a minute. Now you cannot see the presentation, right?
No.
Yeah. Let me try it again. Okay. And then now. Is it working? And you can hear me?
Now all is set.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so you know, it's, as I said before, it's always a pleasure to join events from Universidade de Brasília. It's actually the place where I took my my master degree, right, in management some time ago. But it's always a pleasure to join. Again, I think my presentation today really, in a way, complements the presentation from Professor Katie, because I will actually illustrate with some examples what's the challenge when you are discussing about a multicultural organization. We are going to be focusing more on development banks, on the financial industry, but of course, the takeaways, the conclusions can be applied to any organization, as you may see. The main point from my presentation will be to link risk management to this multicultural organization. As you said before, I'm already an employee of the central bank for more than 20 years, and for more than 20 years working in risk management. Along this time, I had the chance to do the master, the PhD in Spain. And then, as you mentioned, I spent 3 years in the new development bank in Shanghai. Actually, it was a very important point of my career, because in the end we were establishing the risk management function in that organization, and again, many lessons learned in this process that I want to share with you today. So I really think this presentation will add, as you know, as illustrating some of the aspects that Professor Katie presented before. Maybe starting from the end, the main message I would like to convey today is really that in the end, in a multicultural organization, as you're going to see, risk management might have a very critical role in terms of setting a sound ground for the rational decision-making process. This is particularly important when you have the cases of multicultural organizations, because different perceptions of uncertainty, different perceptions of risk, that in the end you need to accommodate in an institution like this. Just a quick disclaimer on these, just to highlight that the views and opinions, right, expressions in these presentations are mine and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the central bank or the new development or even CAF. I also use the Corporación Andina de Fomento as another example to illustrate some of the aspects that we're going to discuss. So in terms of agenda, what we're going to discuss today is a little bit about corporate risk management. Then we're going to discuss about risk preference, how we compare cross-country in terms of this preference, the risk appetite in different countries. And then add the dimension of multicultural aspects, and then try to conclude with some ideas. So, first of all, to start with, is also always good to have a clear view of what's the risk in a way, right? It's a word that we use almost every day, but it's very important for all of us to keep the same concept in order to move ahead in the discussion. So you could think of risk as uncertainty. Uncertainties associated to the outcomes. Anything that you do that may generate different outcomes, and you don't know for sure which outcome is gonna happen, then you're talking about risk. You're talking about something that may or may not happen. Professor Kate mentioned before about uncertainty avoidance, for instance, and comparing different countries in terms of uncertainty avoidance. This is completely linked to the concept of risk. So to have risk, you need to have uncertainties associated to that. Anytime you have an objective, you want to do something, and you're not really sure about the outcome that you're gonna get, then you're talking about a risk event. A good example that I like to give is, for instance, when you talk about, parachute jump, when you're going to jump from an airplane and you're going to jump with a parachute and so on. We all know that this is a risky sport, right? From time to time, even having the right training and the right equipment, you might face, some challenges here, and you might have a bad outcome in the end. You are mitigating lots of this risk when you do lots of training, when you have the right equipment, but still you have uncertainties associated to the final outcome. So this is a risky sport, and we all know that. But what would be the case if you want to jump from an airplane, but without the parachute? You're going to just jump from the airplane, but at this time you don't have the parachute. Is there any uncertainty in the final outcome of this? No, we know the outcome. The outcome is going to be very bad. And in a situation like this, we don't say this is risky, because in the end, you already know the negative outcome that's going to happen. So you need to associate the risk, not with the negative outcome, but with the uncertainties associated to what you are doing. In an organization, this is critical, because there is uncertainty in every single layer of the organization. From a strategic aspect to the operational aspect, you're going to have uncertainties about the processes, about the investments, about the strategy of the company. And in all of these, risk will come to analyze, to evaluate, and then to support the decision-making process of the institution. We'd like to think of risk going in two directions. In one direction, it goes more in a control function. It's like a duality of the risk process. So you go in a control direction. Every time, when you go to a more operational level, you are more on the control side. You really want to mitigate every single operational risk that you might have exposures in your company. But when you go up, when you go more to the strategic level, the strategic objectives of the company, then what you're going to see is risk helping more and more the strategic decision-making process. And the uncertainties are everywhere in a company, right? Every type of company, small, big companies, and so. And it's very hard to take into account all of these uncertainties when you are trying to take a decision, right? It's a very complex, exercise. Sometimes people think that just based on experience, the leader, the manager can then take the right decisions, because, people think we are rational, we're going to take the optimal, solution. We're going to take the optimal solution. But it's not really the case. These problems are typically very complex, many dimensions, many variables that takes into account. And typically, the individuals, they are what we call bounded rational. They're not really completely rational, because our mind, our brain cannot process all this complexity when we are dealing with a decision. But then what we try to do, what people tend to do, is to take satisfactory decisions, but not what would be the optimal decision at its stage. So to help this overall decision-making process is the whole role of the risk management, going in the two directions, control side and the decision side. But in order to understand how to process and how to address these risks, you need to understand first what are your perceptions of risk, what's your risk appetite that in the end will aggregate in the company, the risk appetite of the company. Very quickly, just to understand the whole, list of types of risks that one could deal with, you go from the financial side, very common in every corporate, in every company, like liquidity risk, market credit risk. All these risks are very important for the financial objectives of the company. But you also have what would be more soft objectives related to business, reputation, operational, strategic, even ESG more recently. And all of these have uncertainties, and these uncertainties are then, assessed, measured, reported to the managers, to the senior managers, and so in order to take the right decisions. The question would be, when we face, uncertainty, how the company is prepared to take these risks. What is the level of risk that your company is willing to take. And there's no precise answer. There is no unique answer for this. It will really depend on the risk appetite of every single company, of every single organization. And this, of course, will depend also in how you form this company in terms of, one country, multinationals, and all that. So again, bringing our two main examples that I'm going to come back to them several times in these presentations. Let me give you an example of these two multilateral institutions, right? I'm taking the CAF, I'm taking the New Development Bank. All of the two of them, they are development banks. They are formed by several countries. CAF is what we call a regional development bank. Mostly the countries that take part in CAF are from Latin America and Central America. And then we have the NDB, the New Development Bank, is also called the Bank of the BRICS. And so mainly the countries that take part are Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and China. But recently, other countries are also joining. So these development banks, what they do, they take money from the countries, the government of the countries that they are part, and with this money, they lend for long-term infrastructure projects in each of the countries that are part of the bank, right? So one thing I'd like to show you indeed, and this is just the organogram of these two, the organizational structure of these two banks, is that you see that the risk management is typically, and it follows best practices, it really typically is linked to the senior management of the institution. So in both sides of the equation here, you're going to see risk management, reporting to the general secretary in one case, to the other case to a vice president and chief risk officer. And so again, pretty much, overseeing the overall organization. That's why when I mentioned before, the layer of the operational to the strategic level, risks should be collecting all of this information, from everywhere, and then supporting the decision-making process. So in both cases, you will see risk at the top layer of the institution, of the organization structure of these organizations. And as I said, it follows best practices, right? And shows that risk deals both with financial aspects and also non-financial aspects. This is very small here, but again, just to show a few numbers on these two institutions again. They are both development banks, as I said before. One institution has around $48 billion in total assets, and a balance sheet of $48 billion, and the NDB has $25 billion of assets, so big institutions, relevant institutions, but the main difference among them is that one is regional and the other one is more like a global institution. Other aspect that differ the two institutions is that in one case the leverage of the bank is much higher. In the case of the CAF, it's around 3.6 if you take assets over equity, but if you take in the case of NDB, it's going to be around 2, so it's lower than the case of CAF. If you take the risk of both institutions, so both of them, they have the same objective, invest in long-term projects and so on. But what we're going to see is that the overall risk of the two institutions, they are different. So just to let you know, CAF has a rating of AA- in the scale of rating of risk that's given by Standard & Poor's, and in the case of NDB is a AA+. So less risky than the CAF. So the question is, why, if the institutions, they have the same objective, why they have different risks, different risk profile? What defines this risk profile in these different institutions, right? And that's why I said in the beginning that you don't have just one answer for that. You don't have, one precise level of risk that every single institution should follow. It's not the case at all. Nowadays, I'm back to the Central Bank of Brazil. The balance sheet is at the stage of trillion reais, and the risk profile is completely different from these two institutions here. So Of course, it depends on the objectives, it depends on the profile of the managers, of the senior management of the institution, and these will build what would be the risk profile, the risk appetite of that institution. And the role of risk management is actually to bring transparency to this overall process, right? To bring rationality to all of this process, to be sure that the institution is taking the decisions at the level of risk that it was defined to take. This is very important. And as I said in the very beginning, this is a complex task. And if it's a complex task, you cannot just believe in your or rely on your experience and based on that go on taking decisions. No, you cannot do that. You really need to have a complete framework, a complete governance in place in order to ensure that you are taking the right decisions to that specific organization. This brings us to the discussions of the risk preference. And then now we're going to go to the individuals. So typically, when we discuss about risk preference and the traditional finance, tell us that people are risk averse. Individuals, they tend to avoid uncertainty, and they tend to be risk averse. What does it mean? Risk averse means that you're not going to take risk. Not at all, not at all. Risk averse just means that in order to take more risk, the individuals, they typically require more benefits, more returns. It's like if you're talking about investing in Brazil in fixed income and investing in equities. We know that equities are riskier than fixed income. Fine. So any individual would just invest in equities if they believe that they are going to receive a higher return by investing in equities. So this is what the traditional finance would tell us. But individuals, human beings are more complex than that. So more recently, came the line of thought related to behavioral finance that revealed that in the end, individuals are not always risk averse. What individuals really don't like is to lose. We don't like losses. Losses we don't like at all. And in order to avoid losses, we would even be, willing to take more risk to avoid that loss situation. People say that, for the same size gain and loss, the loss hurts us more, at least as double as, what we are gonna be happy by having some sort of gain. So see how now the problem is even more complex. So individuals, they're going to be put together to create a corporate or a bank or an organization, and then they will define what should be the risk level of that institution. Okay, but even at the individual level, you find differences, not just in terms of the level of risk aversion, but even if they are really being risk averse or risk seekers, because this will depend in terms of how you perceive the loss in different circumstances. So what behavioral finance came to help us understand is the behavior of the individuals when they face uncertainties, when they face risky situations, and again, putting all of this complexity out together. When you try then to compare, to aggregate this information in different countries, what do we find out? We find out the following, that risk not just, are different, risk preference, not just difference, considering different countries. Let's say the risk preference in Brazil might be different from Canada, from China, from Denmark. The risk will not just be difference, but also if you look like in a time series, in different points in time, this risk preference will also, vary along the time. So see again how it's complex, right? I'm just highlighting these two cases, Brazil and Canada, and showing the numbers. Let's just pay attention on the MRP column. MRP stands for market risk premium. So how much extra return you would require for any unit of additional risk in those countries, right? What you see in the line of Brazil is that Brazil is 9.8, numbers from 2022, is a very recent study, so 9.8 for 2022, and in the same time, Canada is 5.7. So Brazil is requiring a much higher premium for additional level of risk than what in Canada someone would require. So completely different the levels of risk preference, right? In an aggregate level, right? We are talking about a country, the whole country. If you take the Brazil line, just the Brazil line in different years, you will see that MRP may change from 9.8 to 7.9 to 7.5 in the past. So this level of risk aversion is changing also along the time. This is also happening in the case of Canada, from 5.7 to 5.9, 5.6, again, changing a little bit along the way. So now imagine you want to put together a company, a bank, or any organization with people from different countries, and you know that there are differences in these individuals, not just in terms of how they see losses and gains, but also, you know, related to the environment that they are used to. So in the case of Brazil, a much higher, level of risk aversion than what you would see in the case of Canada, for instance, right? This brings the complexity in terms of putting it all together and then define what would be the optimal level for the institution as a whole. So when you bring then this overall, context to the case of the organization, what you see is that in the end, the CEO behavior really, influence or impact what would be the risk, appetite of the organization. If he's more or less optimist, if, the level of risk aversion is higher or lower, all of this will have a direct impact in the policies, in the financial policies or risk policies of the institution, and in the end, in the overall strategy and business of that specific organization. Moreover, what we find, and there is a study confirming this, that typically you find commonalities in the risk attitudes inside the firm. Typically, the leaders, they are selected with similar preferences. So the CEO, when he's selecting the vice presidents, when the vice presidents are selecting the directors and all of that, they in the selection process, they try to filter what would be, profiles that are closer to what they think. And that's why we were discussing in the previous presentation about when a multinational organization goes to China, and when China goes to the other countries, what are the differences and what are the impacts? It will be very interesting to see the impacts in terms of uncertainty avoidance, in terms of risk preference, differences in the risk preferences in these two different contexts, right? What can help? What can help in a situation like this is really the governance. In the end, once the corporate is built, once the corporate is, is functioning and all of that, and with time, the corporate will then build its own risk culture. And this risk culture will have support from the governance that is in place. So in a way, ideally, every single individual that you go to the game later will then adapt and accommodate to the, to the level of risk that was, established for that specific organization. But this you won't be able to achieve this if you have a strong corporate governance with risk, functioning well, audit, and all of that. And we know that there are different, perceptions in all of these dimensions. We already saw in the beginning that individuals, they have differences in the way they view risk. This is one. Second, sometimes they view, situations as a loss, and then they are risk seekers. So again, an issue there. Then we saw that when we compare different countries, they have different levels of risk aversion. And then we see that even for the same country, when you see different points in time, this number also differ and varies through time. So all of this will then bring to the final, stage of defining the risk of the corporate, the risk of the organization. Some studies, for instance, have shown that Chinese were more risk-seeking than Americans when you compare these two. I even take one of the points that Professor Katie presented before, when she showed different levels of individualism. This is pretty true that in the end, the US is one of the more individualist societies that we may think of. And then China is in the other directions, a more like collectivist society, right? From a risk perspective, this collectivist societies are seen like, like giving you a buffer, like protecting each other to avoid extreme situations of losses. It's like a social safety net. So there's a social structure provided by the government typically that in the end make people to avoid extreme situations from a financial perspective. Because of this, you are already avoiding, extreme situations, and typically this leads you to be more risk seeker, right, or less risk averse in situations like this when you compare to individualistic societies. So this interaction is very interesting, right? I mean, differences in terms of level of individualism, level of uncertainty avoidance. These will, in the end, have a final impact for the overall organization. So what we see and what is shown is that cross-cultural differences in risk perceptions, they have an impact in the overall organization. And sometimes it is even higher than differences in occupation, differences in training, differences in expertise. You can have people with different expertise. This won't impact that much like, cross-cultural differences in one single organization. So if we bring back the two cases that we are using to illustrate this overall process. So in the case of CAF, again, what you see in this map is the countries that take part in the CAF. You see that majority of the members are from Latin America and Central America. We also have Spain there. And this is an institution that was founded in 1970. So it's a pretty much old, more than 50 years that is there. Characteristics of these countries, well, similar, they have cultural similarities, right? Latin languages, Portuguese, Spanish, religion is pretty much similar, Catholic, Christians, and all that. So there are similarities from a cultural perspective. These countries have also, they are also at the closest stages of economic development. Of course, some differences are there, sure. But, mostly, emerging markets and facing many challenges in terms of growth, in terms of, of development, right? Most of them in Latin America. Another aspect of CAF is because it's already there for more than 50 years. The corporate risk culture is already well established. You already have risk policies that are there, that were tested, and that there for a long time already, right? So the institution, in a way, was able to establish the overall governance and setting very clear what should be the risk appetite of the organization. Of course, facing the challenges in terms of the financial risks of the investments in Latin America, for instance. But in any case, from a risk perspective, it's already well established. The risk culture is already there. And as I mentioned before, the rating, the credit rating or the risk of this institution is perceived by Standard & Poor's as a AA-. So this is the picture of CAF. If we add the new development bank, just to compare the two, what we're going to see? You're going to see an institution that was founded basically by the BRICS countries in 2015, so maybe 7 years old, still in its early stages of development and all that. And if you take the countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, these are the founding members. Later on, Bangladesh and United Arab Emirates, they have entered in the bank. But if you take just the first 5, you're going to see many differences in terms of cultural traits, right? Language completely different, you know, in terms of religion, in terms of values, in terms of, you know, many aspects that would differ from one country to another. Of course, I pretty much like this idea of fluid, you know, intercultural, you know, setting, that in the end, the corporate, the company might be able to accommodate all of these. This was, you know, something that we also perceived in our time at the New Development Bank. But of course, this generates a setting of more, you know, of more internal uncertainties in terms of setting what should be the right level of risk or the right level of uncertainty that the institution should face to deal with this, with its objectives. So the risk culture, by definition, would be still under development, because just 7 years of existence of the institution. And in a case like this, risk would be the solid ground to support the strategic decision. We already saw that different individuals have different risk perceptions. Different individuals from different countries would have, you know, different experiences in terms of levels of risk, appetite, and all that. So if you want to put them all together, the only, or one of the few areas that can, you know, at least rationalize this overall process to define the right level of risk of the institution would be the risk area. So that's why my main message to convey is really, you know, how risk can support and help, you know, the decision, the key decisions for any organization, especially in a case of a multicultural institution like this. When you read the, you know, the reports from the rating agencies, the ones that evaluate the risk of these institutions, when they talk about NDB, one of the key aspects that they highlight is related to the cohesion of the countries, right? Do these countries share the same views in terms of the institution? We already know that they don't share the same views in several other aspects, right? But for the institution, it might not be, you know, an issue. But the main point is, when we bring this to the objectives of the organization, are they really sharing the same values, the same objectives, and then reducing the internal uncertainty about what should be the risk level of the institution? This is that's why you know, risk in a case like this is so critical. So, trying to sum up and then conclude. What we observe along with these discussions today is that yes, individuals differ in their risk preference. And from a risk aversion level, even to a risk seeker level, you may find, depending on how you frame the situation, depending on how the losses are perceived. So one very important point, individuals differ. Culture plays an important role in the risk preference. We saw evidence from different countries, different points in time, with different risk levels. So, I mean, culture is something that you're going to be have a role in this preference. The leaders' risk profile have an impact on the organization risk culture. So, where do the leaders come from? What are the countries that they are part of? And how these will have an interplay in terms of defining the organizational risk culture. All of this is something that should be managed in a good way. And as a last thought, then the strong governance would then require risk to be one of the key components of the strategic decision-making process of the organization. If risk is not playing a good job there, then what you're going to have is a complete divergence in terms of decisions taken in different levels of risk, and in a way bringing to a very suboptimal, you know, decision-making process. That's why risk uncertainty brings lots of value in this overall process. I think with these, I might end. Yeah, I might end this presentation, and of course, being available to any discussions and follow-up questions. Thank you very much. I think I'm still on time. No, the time is still good.
Yeah, it's very good. Thank you so much, Professor José Luís. It was amazing to see how you worked up your thoughts on the risk as the stable component of the culture. Once at the bank you worked at in Shanghai, the culture was something diverse, and very interesting how the numbers you brought, and they illustrate a lot of the cultural differences, and well, beautifully done. Thank you so much for sharing all this information and reflections. So we'll stay open up for the audience to set the questions at our chat and also subscribe. We have here Professor José Márcio, who raised his hand. He did his login as Jan, but he is indeed Professor José Márcio. So please go ahead, José Márcio.
Oh, thank you very much. Such a very good presentations. Very interesting indeed. I have a question for both, but mainly to José Luís. Brazil and China is a growing trade partnership, and we are very distant in terms of culture. But of course, we are converging to a global culture, both countries. But Chinese multinationals are not so present in Brazil yet. My question is, do you think it is something related to risk management and how Chinese multinationals perceive risk in Brazil? Or do you think it is something related to culture, and or because Chinese multinationals are prioritizing investment in Asia? So it's a very simple question, but I think it's fundamental for the economy of Brazil, and I would say fundamental for the economy of South America, when the Chinese multinational decided to truly invest in South America and in Brazil. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
It's a great question, Professor Zermar. Thank you very much. And yes, what I could add on that, when you see global investors, right? Let's take the standpoint of a global investor, not just China, but can be any global investor. Nowadays, as you know, the world is pretty much globalized, and from an investment perspective, the money can go everywhere, almost everywhere. And when you want to take this decision of investment, the point of risk is pretty much important. And not just the level of risk, but even, if you are able or not to have an assessment of the risks in that particular region of the globe. When we bring to the case of Latin America, what complicates, up to a certain extent, the situation, not just in Brazil, but in other countries in Latin America, is really that you may face risks that you cannot not even, measure, you cannot even assess. Because there is lots of instability from the political side, changes and here and there, contracts and all of that. That from an international investor perspective, of course, this will generate lots of reluctance. If they have other alternatives, which more stable rules, or in places that they can maybe influence more, even the setting of investment in that country, this would help a lot. So what I see that we have lots of homework to do and to work on is to better or to clarify further, the rules of the game. I mean, people needs to perceive Brazil as, or any other Latin American country as, a country that the rules, you understand the risk. The risk can be higher, but then it's going to be a matter of adjusting the return, the level of risk or so. But at least the rules of the game would be already set. But for this, you need planning. You need long-term view. I pretty much enjoyed the graph that Professor Katie presented before when she mentioned about long-term perspective. And China was, in the top, and Brazil was on the other side of the equation. You need that. You need policies that, you know, really understand the country in a long-term perspective, set the rules of the game, and then the money and the investments will come. The point of the culture, of course, plays an important role, but maybe you may find this in the case of China and other countries, in other places, like in Africa, for instance, right? That they are investing massively also in Africa, and then implementing, you know, the way of thinking in terms of, you know, how to manage the organization and values and all of that. What I could perceive, but again, it's just a perception in terms of the Chinese view, is that they are very pragmatic in terms of, you know, observing the globe, observing, you know, ways they do have this long-term planning in terms of, you know, costs and benefits and all of that. And to that, they will follow and they will find, you know, best alternatives to invest. But maybe Professor Katie can add on that too.
I'm not sure I'm the right, you know, the exact right person to answer the question, but Professor Fernandes has already explained the big part. I just want to add something here because of the, you know, ideological differences. I think in China, for state-owned enterprises to go overseas, it's mostly the government's decision. So if the leaders of the, you know, two countries could reach certain agreements that will help, you know, the state-owned enterprises to go in that country, and that will help. I'm not sure how, you know, the political climate is between the two countries. You know, I think mostly friendly, but if there's some, you know, economic agreements reached, that will definitely help the state-owned enterprises, which are the big parts. I mean, at least half of the investment, foreign direct investment from China, at least, to go to, you know, Latin American countries, including Brazil. The Belt and Country, I'm sure you have heard of the Belt and Road initiative proposed by President Xi. So I think the state-owned enterprises will, you know, follow the government's baton, just, you know, the direction, just to go to the places that has strategic, you know, strategic significance for China, and that I think politics is very important part of the, you know, the factors, very important factor in Chinese enterprises going abroad. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor José Luís and Professor Katie. José Márcio, you wanna still comment something because you still have your raised hand, or just forgot?
Yeah, just a quick word.
Okay.
Brazil and China, we have a long tradition of diplomatic engagement, and we have a good tradition of international relations, a very positive one. And we have several projects that goes together in space industry, in communications, in infrastructure. But we did not have Chinese migration to Brazil. We don't have that, let's say, strong migration of Chinese in Brazil. We had that of Japanese in several parts of Asia, but not really Chinese. And I think that's also create a kind of problem in order to reach a more to increase this mutual confidence in both sides. And we have some Brazilian multinationals invest in China, and we are quite late also to invest in China, but also increasing in several industries. So we have, let's say, this reciprocity in terms of investment, but a lot to do in the coming years. And I would say that the future is bright for both sides.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. Yeah, to add to Professor Fernandez' talk, the Chinese are, on Hofstede's value dimensions, Chinese are low in uncertainty avoidance, that, theoretically, is more risk driven, would like to take risk for Chinese. I know some private owned enterprises, even though they are small scale, they go to Africa, go to Southeast Asia, some countries that are drastically different from China. And, they are not afraid of taking risks. So yeah, that's something.
This also, Professor Katie, completely could see this also by living in Shanghai these years, and of course the economy growing also helps a lot this overall process, right? When you are in a country that is growing 5-6% every year, and then it's driven by initiatives, by investments, and so on. You have this people are willing to take those risks, right? Because in one side you have the government hedging the very loss aversion loss situation, and then you have a positive cycle in terms of people taking the initiative then to invest internally, to invest abroad, take risks, and of course this generate grow and so on. So this was something that we could also perceive there. And again, these are lessons that countries, especially in Latin America, they can learn from that, right? We saw lots of interactions in terms of trade. The trade, from China to Latin America to Brazil specifically is very high, but we need also to benefit from this interaction in terms of planning, of values, in terms of to promote the growth in the country. I think from this will be very interesting, and that's why when you're discussing about this level of uncertainty, aversion, and the risk and so on. That's why, cases that we could see from multinational organizations that come from China to Brazil and to other countries, how they interplay locally, right? How they interplay, if they still keep that level of uncertainty that they had originally, or if they adapt to the circumstances of the new country with a completely different level of, individualism. This would be something very interesting to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, we still have, thank you so much. We still have time for our last questions from the audience, if someone wants to set one. And if they're shy and do not, I just wanted to set a last reflection. So since our audience is mostly from students from the business field, management, accounting, economy, public policies, I would like to ask Professor Kathy and Professor José Luís, what are the challenges? So for Kathy, the challenges in the studies of interculturality that you would give as an advice for the students, like keep this in mind, looking into the future. This is things that you should work on or be aware of. And for Professor José Luís, what challenges would you advise that the students they should engage on or try to resolve or to study about that in terms of governance in multicultural organizations? So if you just could give looking into the future, what can we not miss in terms of formation, educational formation?
Since I gave the talk first, I'll just speak first. In terms of interculturality, I think students should learn those value dimensions of culture, those previous, prior scholars researches, the prior researches, and the, read about their research of cross-cultural comparison, to understand, there are cultural differences, and as well as understanding the local concepts such as face, 关系. 关系 is another Chinese concept. It's basically interrelations between people, but it's more than that. It's basically, it's also a social capital where you can use, it's a social resource where you can use to help your business. And like a hierarchy, right? And that's also power distance, right? And so understand the local culture, cultural concepts, but at the same time understand that these are, some summarized cultural differences. They can be helpful in, to help us understand culture, but when you deal with individuals, you have to be aware of the fluidity of culture, individual culture, and people can, adapt, people accommodate to, to each other's styles. And so cultural differences do not necessarily mean there's always these conflicts and that cannot, conflicts can be, and even though there's conflict, they can be inspiring, and they can be solved peacefully. And so, yeah, bear in mind that stereotypes should be avoided too, and avoid cultural essentialism that that just categorize culture and think that the cultural characteristics are unchanging. So just be sensitive, I think, cultivate your intercultural competence, being, having a global mindset, and studying abroad or, working abroad may help you develop your global mindset and to just broaden your cognitive capacity. Yeah, I think that just to make a person a better person. Yeah, only when you experience that can you understand what I'm talking about. But I think you can imagine your experience actually help you understand the people from different cultures, where they're coming from, why they do such things, and how to accommodate or adapt and to create a better, communication climate. Yeah. So that's my suggestion for the students.
These are great advice, I would say. Great advice to all of them. And yeah, maybe what I could add on that, well, typically we think of Brazil is a very large country, right? So it's usual for us, I mean, when I see young people, right, to think always like inside Brazil, right? So, with the size of a continent, so like China, but in the end here, I think people are still in that phase of, going to one state to another state, and moving inside the country, right? But we should, especially when we are young and with the energy and we are open-minded and so on, to think that in the end, nowadays the world is really globalized in terms of opportunities, in terms of education, and all of that. And we should really consider that. You just learn, I mean, in situations like this, right? When you have to deal with people from other countries, when you study abroad and all of that, these are very inspiring situations, really, when you need to learn from the others, from different perspectives, different points of view, and so on. In terms of the organization, from an organization or for a corporate, to have in mind that in the end, corporate must have, especially, I mean, you may have your own views, their own views, but you should find a common ground. You should find a level of debate, that then at that level, it's a technical discussion, it's a solid ground that can, bring to the next step for the organization to take the right strategic decisions and so on. So, transparency is very important. Technical, considerations, very, very important. Long-term planning, very important. All of this is embedded in the idea of governance, a governance that's well established, especially if you are talking about a big institution. I would definitely, for sure, recommend students to look, opportunities abroad too, at least for, for a while. I mean, stay there, work for 1-2 years in one country, another country, learn another language, go on building your CV in a more global way. I had the chance to participate in several recruitment processes for the NDB there, right? And typically it's a global recruitment process, and we received many CVs from many countries, right? What we could clearly see is that people from China and from India, they were already in this track of going abroad, of, doing, PhDs abroad, doing masters abroad, and then coming back to China eventually to, to next steps in their careers or so. And typically South Africa, Brazil, mostly still inside the country, building their career just inside the country. So I think just to keep in mind that, you have global opportunities out there. Opportunities in multilateral development banks are great places to work. Great places. And sometimes you open a position in a bank like this, and you don't have one single candidate from Brazil or from other countries that have this, this local home bias, right? And they just look for home opportunities and all that. So definitely I recommend you to look for opportunities abroad and look for opportunities in multilateral development banks, and DB is a great place to work. So please consider this too in the future, and open mind, always keep in mind that in the end you have 2 ears, right? And just one mouth. So you need to hear more, understand more, and then, express your views in the right tone. I think these are the main things.
Okay, great, awesome advices. I think not only students, but we are also taking it very serious and trying to provide a more international environment and opportunities as well in the matter of exchanges and partnerships. But it was awesome to hear you both and have you with us today in the morning for us here in Brazil. It is getting late for Kathy in China, so thank you so much for your time and availability there as well. I just wanted to highlight some of the words that were repeated as values to keep in mind as wrapping up. So they definitely in young values, and I would say philosophy even, we should keep that in mind. The aspect of fluidity and the liquid culture as well, the need of development of a sensitivity, a cultural sensitivity, and of course the matter of transparency and building up the possibilities to melt together different cultural aspects, the need of a better and more clear communication and more cultural aware communication, and the aspect of governance. So this is a lot of important inputs that you brought for us today in this session, in the morning and in the night. So thank you. I don't know how to thank more because it was great. Great to see you. I'm looking forward for our next steps in terms of research, in terms of partnership, in terms of classes that you're going to teach for us at the department. So we're going to be belonging still to the same network, and I hope we can have ourselves again joining in the future for further discussions, or for a coffee in Brazil, or for a tea in China. Okay, so here I finish my interaction. I will hand over the word to Jan, who is the student who is organizing the session, just to finish, and then we can stay a little bit more to just chat. Okay, so please, and to stop the record. Okay, Jan, are you there?
Yes, teacher. Thus, we concluded the internationalization session, and we thank the participants of the session for their participation in the 10th SEADM. We inform you that the statements will be sent by email. They will also be available on your tickets at Simpla within 24 hours for those who stayed 75% of the round-the-table time. We also remind you that later we will have more activities at SEADM. Remember, participate in your solidarity campaign. We are accepting donations of clothing and non-perishable food. Donations can be delivered to ADEM Faces ground floor. We will be very grateful if you can help us in the campaign. We thank our sponsors, Fazenda and Mercado Malunga. Barlevento, Estratégia Financeira, Eloá Novaes Estética Facial, and the co-editors of Administrator Gilson Joel Fernandes. Thank you. Good morning.